Before churches, before paintings, before history turned memory into legend, there were cities filled with dust, noise, hunger, hope, and fear. The world Jesus walked through was not silent or sacred in appearance. It was loud, crowded, political, dangerous. Stone streets baked under relentless sun. Roman soldiers watched from fortified towers. Merchants shouted over one another in crowded markets. Farmers struggled against drought and taxes, and ordinary people waited desperately for something to change. To understand the message that transformed history, we must first step into the world where it was spoken. This is what life was really like in the cities of Jesus' time. First-century Judea was a land caught between faith and empire. Rome ruled with absolute authority. Its banners flew above ancient cities that had existed for centuries before Roman power arrived. Governors enforced order, taxes funded distant emperors, soldiers ensured obedience. Yet beneath Roman control lived a deeply religious society shaped by ancient laws and sacred traditions. Every aspect of life, from food to family to festivals, was tied to faith. The region was not one unified place, it was a patchwork of cultures and landscapes. Jerusalem stood as the spiritual heart. Nazareth rested quietly among northern hills. Jericho thrived as a desert oasis, and the villages around the Sea of Galilee pulsed with fishermen, farmers, and traders. Each city carried its own rhythm, its own struggles, and together they formed the stage upon which history would unfold. Life for most people was simple, but never easy. Homes were small stone structures, often shared by extended families and animals. Floors were packed earth, roofs doubled as living spaces during cool evenings. Water had to be carried daily, sometimes from distant wells. Morning began before sunrise. Women ground grain into flour using heavy stones, preparing bread that sustained families through long days of labor. Men walked fields, tended vineyards, repaired tools, or traveled to nearby markets hoping to sell enough goods to survive another week. Food was modest: bread, olives, figs, lentils, and occasionally fish. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or special occasions. Children learned early that survival required contribution. They worked beside parents, learning trades passed down through generations. Disease was common, medical knowledge was limited. A minor injury could become fatal. Life expectancy was short, and loss was familiar. Yet community bound people together. Shared meals, religious gatherings, and weekly rest days offered moments of peace in an otherwise uncertain world. Faith was not separate from daily life, it was the center of it. Beneath everyday routines, tension quietly grew. Roman taxation weighed heavily on farmers and fishermen. Many lived one failed harvest away from debt or displacement. Wealth gathered among elites while ordinary families struggled. Religious leaders debated law and purity, seeking to preserve identity under foreign rule. Different groups interpreted faith differently, each believing they protected truth. And everywhere lingered expectation. Ancient prophecies spoke of deliverance. Many believed a chosen leader would come, someone who would restore justice, defeat oppression, and renew the nation. Whispers traveled through markets and synagogues. Stories of prophets and miracle workers spread quickly in a land hungry for hope. People were waiting, not just for political freedom, but for meaning in suffering. Jerusalem was unlike any other city. During festivals, its population swelled dramatically. Pilgrims flooded narrow streets, arriving from distant regions. Animals destined for sacrifice filled courtyards. Priests performed rituals inside the towering temple complex, the spiritual center of Jewish life. The temple dominated the skyline, massive stone walls gleaming in sunlight. For many, it represented the very presence of God among humanity. But beneath its grandeur lay tension. Roman troops monitored crowds carefully. Any unrest could spark swift and brutal response. Meanwhile, Far from Jerusalem's grandeur, Nazareth existed almost unnoticed, a small hillside village of laborers and craftsmen. Life moved slowly there. Few outsiders visited. It was a place where ordinary people lived invisible lives. Jericho, by contrast, thrived economically. Palm trees and trade routes made it prosperous. Travelers moving between regions passed through its gates, bringing stories, goods, and rumors. And around Galilee, fishing villages hugged the shoreline. Boats launched at dawn. Nets were cast again and again, success never guaranteed. It was here, among workers and common people, that movements began to spread. Not in palaces, but among those who had little power. As crowds gathered in marketplaces and along dusty roads, something unusual began to happen. Teaching spread rapidly through villages. People traveled miles to listen. The message was not about wealth or rebellion. It spoke of humility, mercy, forgiveness, and a kingdom not defined by armies or borders. The poor felt seen. The sick felt hope. Outsiders found belonging. Crowds grew larger. Authorities grew concerned. Jerusalem, already tense under Roman oversight, became a place where spiritual expectation and political fear collided. Leaders worried about unrest. Rome feared uprising. In a city where thousands gathered for sacred celebrations, even a single spark could ignite chaos. And history shows that powerful messages often threaten established systems, not through violence, but through transformation. The streets that once echoed with ordinary trade and prayer became witnesses to events that would change the course of civilization. After the climactic events that unfolded in Jerusalem, life did not instantly transform. Markets reopened, fishermen returned to the sea, farmers worked fields as they always had. Rome remained in control. Poverty did not disappear overnight, yet something invisible had changed. Stories spread from village to village. Travelers carried accounts across regions and beyond borders. Communities formed around shared belief and shared memory. Nazareth was no longer just an unknown village. Galilee became associated with teachings remembered for generations. Jericho remained a crossroads where stories traveled outward, and Jerusalem became forever linked with events that reshaped faith and history. What began in small streets and humble homes slowly expanded into a movement that crossed continents. It is easy to imagine ancient history as distant and holy, untouched by ordinary struggle. But the cities of Jesus' time were filled with people remarkably like us. They worried about food, they feared authority, they hoped for justice, they searched for meaning in uncertain times. Their world was not perfect, it was fragile, divided, and restless. And perhaps that is why the message born there endured. Because it emerged not from comfort, but from hardship, not from power, but from ordinary lives lived under extraordinary pressure. The dusty streets of Jerusalem, the quiet hills of Nazareth, the trade routes of Jericho, and the waters of Galilee were not just locations in history, they were living places where hope met reality. And in those crowded markets and humble homes, amid empire and expectation, a story began, one that continues to shape human history thousands of years later. The lesson of those cities is not only about the past, it is a reminder that history's greatest transformations often begin in the most ordinary places, among ordinary people, waiting for light in a complicated world.